Imagine a seashore, bathed in the bright May sun of 42. The steppe wind carries the scent of wormwood and salt water, and the horizon seems endless. But this idyll is deceptive. At the very edge of the surf, where the Kerch Strait separates the peninsula from the mainland, thousands of people have gathered. They look to the east, where the Taman shores are visible beyond a narrow strip of water. In their eyes, there is no hope, only extreme fatigue and a lack of understanding of how a powerful front with a twofold superiority in tanks and aircraft turned into an uncontrollable mass in a matter of days. Amidst this chaos, a figure stands out. A man in a perfectly ironed uniform with commissar stars. He looks at what is happening not with sympathy, but with furious indignation, frantically writing down in his notebook the names of those he will hold responsible for this catastrophe. His name is Lev Mekhlis, and he has just lost a battle that could not have been lost if war obeyed only regulations and political slogans. The Crimean campaign of 42 began as a triumph of will and courage. After the heaviest defensive battles of 41, when the enemy captured almost the entire peninsula and besieged Sevastopol, the Soviet command decided to deliver a crushing counterblow. The amphibious operation in Kerch and Feodosia at the end of December 41 was daring, large-scale, and, contrary to many predictions, successful. Soldiers landed in icy water, recaptured bridgeheads, and forced the enemy to retreat in panic. It seemed that one more effort, and Crimea would be completely liberated, and the siege of Sevastopol lifted forever. Enormous resources were transferred to the Kerch Peninsula. 3 full armies, the 44th, 47th, and 51st, took up positions on the narrow isthmus, preparing for a decisive leap. However, it was here, on the narrow expanse of the Akmonay Isthmus, where the land is only 18 kilometers wide, that the knot of tragedy was tied. To direct the energy of the troops into the right channel, a special representative of the Stavka, Army Commissar First Rank Lev Mekhlis, was sent to Crimea. His personality was the epitome of that era. Fanatical, ruthless to himself and those around him, he saw in war not the art of strategy, but a matter of discipline and political loyalty. Arriving at the front, his first action was not to study maps and the state of the rear, but to search for panic mongers and insufficiently decisive commanders. His presence shackled the will of the generals more than enemy fire. The front commander, Dmitry Kozlov, found himself in the position of a man who had to manage a huge mechanism, while a controller with the right to immediate execution for any doubt stood over his soul. The situation on the isthmus was paradoxical. Soviet troops had a significant numerical superiority. More than 250,000 people, hundreds of tanks and guns were concentrated on this patch of land. The density of troops was incredible, division upon division, regiment upon regiment. This created the illusion of indestructible power, but in reality, it turned the armies into an unwieldy target. Mekhlis, guided by the dogma that the Soviet army should only advance, imposed a strict ban on the creation of deeply echeloned defenses. Digging full-height trenches, creating minefields in the rear, and building fallback positions were interpreted by him as a manifestation of defensism and cowardice. Soldiers had to stand in dense chains, ready to rush forward at any second, even if ahead was only a bare step under the sights of enemy artillery. The external conflict unfolded according to the laws of classic military drama, where one side gambled on maneuver and the other on mass. German General Erich von Manstein, commanding the 11th Army, understood that he had little chance in a head-on collision. He saw how Soviet troops had literally clawed their way into the narrow isthmus, but at the same time, he noticed their main weakness, a monstrous overcrowding. German aviation dominated the air, and every sortie turned into an unpunished beating. Bombs fell into dense crowds of people who had no right to dig into the ground. The field airfields of the Crimean Front were under constant attack, and Soviet fighters often didn't even have time to get airborne. The visible conflict lay in the clash of two military schools. The flexible Wehrmacht tactics, relying on the interaction of different branches of service, and the rigid, centralized system, suppressing initiative, built by Mekhlis. Within this grandiose confrontation, thousands of personal tragedies unfolded. Army commanders, experienced combat officers, were reduced to mere executors of the Commissar's will. Mekhlis personally interfered in the deployment of every battalion, rearranged artillery at his discretion, and countermanded the orders of professional military men. He could summon a general for interrogation in the middle of the night and demand explanations why an offensive, scheduled for dawn, was delayed due to a lack of shells. For Mekhlis, there were no objective reasons such as impassable roads, fuel shortages, or lack of communication. There was only will and order. This created an atmosphere of paralyzing fear. Officers were afraid to show initiative, understanding that any success would be attributed to the Commissar, and any failure would be grounds for a tribunal. Ordinary soldiers, seeing the incompetence of the leadership and the senseless deaths of comrades under airstrikes, lost faith in victory. The psychological breakdown occurred long before the enemy launched a decisive offensive. At the ideological level, the conflict in Crimea revealed a deep contradiction between political idealism and the harsh reality of industrial warfare. The idea that high morale, fueled by party slogans, could compensate for a lack of tactical flexibility shattered against the iron logic of German tank wedges. Mekhlis genuinely believed that the fear of punishment was the best incentive for heroism. He tried to manage the war in the same way that industrial construction projects were managed, through slogans, purges, and shock work. But war is not a construction project. It does not forgive the disregard for the laws of physics and logistics. Two worldviews clashed. One believed that a person is a cog that can be forced to work at the limit of their strength through pressure. The other that a person is a tool whose effectiveness depends on skillful application. The turning point came on May 8, 1942. Manstein began an operation codenamed Bustard Hunt. Instead of the expected strike on the center, the Germans launched a diversionary attack in the north and unleashed their main thrust on the southern flank along the Black Sea coast. Here, the Soviet defense was weakest, as Mekhlis had expected the attack elsewhere. German infantry landed in boats behind the defending units, sowing panic. It was a masterstroke that collapsed the entire front within hours. Soviet units, deprived of centralized command and communication, which was destroyed by aviation in the very first minutes, began to retreat chaotically. Mekhlis, who just yesterday had threatened everyone with executions, found himself in a situation where his orders were no longer heard by anyone. He tried to personally stop the retreating troops, but the avalanche was too great. The climax came in mid-May. The enormous grouping of the Crimean Front found itself pressed against Kerch. This was not an organized retreat, it was a collapse. Tens of thousands of people gathered at the crossings, which were constantly bombed by German planes. Equipment was abandoned, ammunition depots exploded, and communication was completely absent. General Kozlov and Mekhlis, in the last days before the fall of the city, were not engaged in organizing evacuation, but in mutual accusations. As a result, a command for general evacuation was given, but there were no means to transport such a large number of people. Of 250,000 people, less than half managed to be evacuated. The rest remained on the shore, either captured or trying to find a last refuge in the depths of the earth. When German tanks entered Kerch, chaos reigned on the surface. But underground, a legend began to be born. Units that had not managed to evacuate, remnants of headquarters and thousands of civilians went into the Ajimushkai quarries. These were huge underground labyrinths where shell rock had once been mined. Here, in complete darkness and dampness, an unparalleled underground garrison of more than 10,000 people was formed. Under the leadership of Colonel Yagunov, people transformed the limestone tunnels into an impregnable fortress. It was a war of nerves and resources. The defenders had no food, no medicine, and, most terrifyingly, no water. The only sources of moisture were outside and under enemy fire. Every bucket of water cost several lives. The Germans, unable to take the quarries by storm, began to use gas attacks, pumping poisonous substances into the ventilation shafts. People died in agony, but refused to come out. The defense of Ajimushkai lasted 170 days. It was the final chord of the Kerch catastrophe, which transformed the shame of defeat into a symbol of the indomitable human spirit. While official reports remained silent about the fall of the front, the struggle continued underground. Hungry, exhausted people made daring sorties, seizing weapons and food from the enemy. When the last defenders were captured in October 42, only a few dozen remained. This confrontation showed that even when the command makes fatal mistakes, when the strategy has failed and the front has collapsed, there remains the personal choice of each fighter. Ajimushkai became a moral counterweight to Mekhlis's administrative madness. The rout of the Crimean Front was a shock for Moscow. The consequences were catastrophic. The fall of Kerch opened the way for the Germans to the Caucasus and predetermined the fate of the Sevastopol fortress, which was now completely isolated without hope of a relief strike. Lev Mekhlis was demoted and removed from the post of Deputy People's Commissar of Defense. In his famous telegram, Stalin sternly told him that Mekhlis is not the Stavka, and his task was to assist the command, not to replace it with his dictatorship. However, the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who became victims of this experiment to strengthen the spirit by prohibiting defensive works could not be brought back. The losses were enormous, and for a long time, efforts were made not to mention this operation so as not to cast a shadow on the system of political leadership of the troops. The resonance of this tragedy is felt even today. The history of the Crimean Front in 1942 is an eternal reminder of what happens when ideology tries to replace professionalism. It is a lesson about the harm of blind stubbornness, and that the true courage of a commander lies not in the ability to threaten a tribunal, but in responsibility for the lives of their subordinates. In modern conflicts, we see the same pitfalls: the centralization of power in one pair of hands, the suppression of initiative from below, and the unwillingness to acknowledge obvious facts for the sake of a pretty picture in reports. The tragedy near Kerch teaches us that reality always takes its toll, and the price for ignoring its laws in wartime is always measured in human lives. It also teaches us that even in the deepest darkness of defeat, there is room for a feat that transcends the scale of the war itself. Concluding our journey along those sun-drenched yet bitterness-soaked shores, we return once again to the image of that May day. The Kerch Strait still carries its waters, and the steppe wind sways the grass in places where armies once stood. Today, we know that the shameful defeat of 1942 was followed by a hard-won understanding of how to fight. The Soviet Army learned to build echeloned defenses. value communication, and trust the initiative of officers. But the price of this knowledge was paid there, on the Ak-Monet Isthmus, and in the cold corridors of Ajimushkai. History demands remembrance, so that those who look at the sea today remember those who looked at it in the spring of 1942, awaiting salvation that never came, and those who chose to remain in the darkness of the quarries to preserve dignity where everything else was lost.